being here. I'm Antonio Zapulla. I'm CEO at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, where we work to strengthen free, fair, and informed societies with media and legal initiatives. And for a few years now, we've really been putting a light and shining a light on the issue of lawfare, a trend that sees the law increasingly being weaponized to silence journalists and media freedom. And last year here in Perugia, we actually presented a report that really looks at the issue of lawfare. And it's a report that really used quantitative and qualitative data to assess this rising threat. And what we've seen is that we've gone way beyond libel and defamations as tool to try to silence journalists, and we've seen slaps, cybercrime, financial crimes being used to try to silence and discredit journalists, fake news legislation, counter-terrorism, anti-extremism law, and foreign influence and treason. So these are the rising threats against journalists. If you want to read this report, you can find it at medialegalattacks.com. It's a report that we did with the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. The research also shows that 50% of the journalists that we polled within our network all directly or indirectly, meaning through their newsroom, experience legal threats. So this year we want to shift the focus towards the lawyers who are defending this journalist and media freedom. Obviously, lawyers play a critical role in safeguarding media freedom and therefore in safeguarding our democracies. And we're actually seeing very interesting trends. We're seeing a similar playbook really affecting lawyers that are protecting media freedom. We just, in the process of releasing a report that we conducted with Covington, a law firm, and this Covington report actually identifies 20 major cases. But obviously we know that this is just the tip of the iceberg because these are threats that don't really get public attention, they don't get media coverage, they don't result often in court cases. And what we've seen is that, again, as we've seen with the journalists, often these threats against the legal professionals don't happen in isolation. They occur with online harassment, surveillance, even physical threats, and they obviously have a ripple effect in reducing the pool of lawyers that want to take these cases on, want to work in defending journalists. So today we really want to delve into this conversation. We have an amazing group of speakers with us. We got Carlos Gallo, who is the CEO of Media Defense. We got Keelan Gallagher, KC, a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers. We got Karuna Nundi, who's a senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India. And online, we should be having with us Ruben Samora, who is a chief communication and impact officer and son of Ruben Samora, who's the founder of El Periódico, an independent newspaper in Guatemala, who's currently in jail. So I would like to start with you, Carlos, because our organizations have been working very closely, both with the legal network of journalists at risk, which we co-founded with CPJ, but also with this report from Covington. So what I really would like to understand from you is if you can help us contextualize this threat, and when did we see this trend emerging, and is it actually a global trend?
Thank you, Antonio, and thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for the invitation to join the panel. The report that's coming out is very timely because this is not a new issue. It's not necessarily attacks against journalists who defend human rights defenders, opposition politicians, or journalists. It's not necessarily a new phenomenon, but it has picked up pace over the last 5 to 10 years, I'd say. In our experience at Media Defense, supporting the legal defense of journalists, we have seen and we have dealt with a few cases over the years where we can see a number of tactics being used to silence journalists by threatening or arresting or persecuting their lawyers. And these are very effective. They're very, very effective because they send a message not only to that individual lawyer, but to the whole profession. Don't dare to touch these cases because we'll go after you. And I think Samora will have a very good tale to tell us about what his father has been going through in Guatemala, a supposedly democratic country with a very progressive president at the moment, but he's still in jail in preventive detention. And what we've seen changing a little bit in terms of trends, we have seen the last 5 to 6 years mainly, the continuous use of arbitrary detention, arbitrary disbarment of lawyers, so preventing them from actually going to court to represent their clients, criminal lawsuits, and we have a plethora of accusations that are used against lawyers, from tax evasion to treason to lèse majesté crimes, falsification of documents, and intervention falsifying arguments in court even, which is quite surprising. And these lawyers are being arrested, they're being prevented from doing their work, but they're also, and this is I think a recent trend, and we've talked about it in previous occasions, the surveillance, the use of technology to carry out surveillance against journalists, human rights defenders, opposition politicians, but also their lawyers. And at least one case that we have worked on, and I can give a few details later, the lawyer was, we imagine he was a victim of surveillance, of Pegasus spyware, and the government wasn't satisfied with that, so they actually went and arrested him and confiscated all his electronic devices. And that's 3 days before we had a deadline to file an application to the European Court of Human Rights in late 2022. So that sends fear to the journalist, to everyone around that journalist, to us who are safely working from London without any threat directed at us, but also makes us think, how about the security of the information that this lawyer is manipulating, the information that he has from other sources, from his clients, that we can't count that they will respect the secrecy of the legal profession. And the more subtle ways that are very difficult to document, and I think the report has a chapter on that, are the threats. So subtle threats against the family, messages are left to lawyers indicating that they should drop the case, online threats, online harassment, and this is happening every day to many of the lawyers, some of the lawyers we work with. We have a limited number of cases we're supporting, and that's very, very problematic and very dangerous. We need to find a way to support these lawyers so that they can continue defending these journalists, ultimately to make sure that journalists continue reporting. I think that's the ultimate objective, and we need to find a way to support the means so that journalism can continue to flourish.
Keelan, I'm going to move to you very quickly. So you represent very high-profile journalists and their family. Maria Ressa, Jimmy Lai, obviously the pro-democracy campaigner in Hong Kong, who founded upholding and has been in prison since 2020. You also represent the family of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the journalist that was killed in Malta in 2017. The UN Secretary General replies, a report that came out in September, actually names you specifically as one of the lawyers that has been receiving particularly an acute threat. And when we spoke ahead of this panel, you said, I've been in this space for a long time, but I've never seen anything at this scale. Can you help us unpack that? What do you actually mean with that?
Yeah, of course. So I've acted in quite sensitive cases for about 20 years, against states such as China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt. And for many years, what I experienced as an international lawyer based in London, in Europe, away from these countries, but bringing the international cases, was kind of secondary targeting. So anyone who's acted in a case against Iran will have had an experience of an attempt to hack their email. That's now completely routine. If you act in a case against Saudi Arabia or taking on MBS, it's quite routine to find yourself potentially on a list being subjected to cyber surveillance or attempted hacking of your emails. But the target has been, for many years, to attempt to access confidential information about your client. So the lawyer is really caught in the slipstream. You're very secondary to the real target, which is your client. That's the key aim of it. And that's what we've seen for a very long time. But what we've started to see now is a shift. And if I may, I of course agree with what Carlos said about how targeting lawyers is not a new phenomenon. And I think for many years what we saw was, for international lawyers, that secondary kind of way of just trying to access confidential information about your client. And then, of course, for lawyers in autocratic countries, we saw for many years lawyers being targeted directly in very aggressive ways. I mean, Sergei Magnitsky, after whom Magnitsky sanctions are named, of course, worked in a Russian law firm and was targeted precisely because of his work in a Russian law firm. Many other examples, and regrettably many lawyers and their families who I've represented who've been targeted in those countries. What I'm now seeing, and why I said it's on another level when we had that conversation, Antonio, is really two things. First, the most extreme bully tactics, which we were previously seeing deployed in autocratic states within their own borders, are now being used transnationally. And there's many examples of that. I'll just give one. Lu Siwei, a very brilliant human rights lawyer in China, was seized in transit on his way to the US via Thailand in July 2023, where he was en route to see his wife and his child and to live in exile in the US. So the long arm of the Chinese state reached out to capture him when he was in transit, and he was then brought back to China. So that's a very troubling case. So previously, lawyers in exile were left alone or were targeted through cyber targeting. That kind of thing is obviously very concerning. And then the other example is international lawyers who may never have set foot in the country itself are being targeted in a way like I've never seen before. And it might sound like an odd phrase to use given what I've experienced, but I'm very conscious that I have a privilege of being a Western white woman based in London with a strong support network. I don't have family members in Hong Kong or China. So when the Hong Kong and Chinese authorities have targeted me because of my international legal work, and when I was asked by the UN reprisals team if I would be willing to be public about it, because so many people who are targeted by the Hong Kong and Chinese authorities have to be anonymous, I felt, well, I've got to use my privilege, which helps to shine a light on these things. And that's why in the Secretary General's reprisals report last year, we're the only case which is named in some detail, because the many other anonymous people who are targeted have family members in Hong Kong, have family members in China. So I'm acutely conscious that what we're experiencing is nothing compared to what happens to those who are in exile. I don't know if you want me to say anything about what we've experienced.
Yeah, I actually was really keen to talk about the role of technology because, again, you mentioned how lawyers are not trained in cybersecurity. Maybe journalists are beginning to be trained in cybersecurity, but when you study at law school, they don't teach you cybersecurity. And now it's becoming almost a key component of your job.
Absolutely. So I'll say one thing about our specific example and then just some more general points about people who are acting in this space. So in our specific example, just to give you a flavour of what we experienced just from acting in the Jimmy Lai case and representing Jimmy Lai before United Nations bodies, I experience a whole range of different, very aggressive and frankly very frightening tactics. So it includes some things like, for example, when we appear before a UN body, there being a very aggressive statement from the Hong Kong authorities claiming that we're criminal for raising the case before the United Nations, threatening us with prosecution under the national security law and other laws for doing our jobs, for being lawyers. We also receive a wide range of threats making clear that if we enter into a territory like the UAE, for example, that we may be at risk of deportation, extradition, etc. We also get hit pieces calling us enemies of the state in Chinese state media on a very regular basis, and then a very wide range of cyber tactics. And I kind of think of it like, that fairground game, whack-a-mole. Like quite often on a really key day in the case, I'll wake up to multiple rape threats, death threats, threats to my kids, threats to my husband. I'll simultaneously get a notification from my bank to say there have been repeated attempts to hack your personal bank account. I'll also get messages saying there have been attempts to hack my chamber's email or to hack online secure systems that we use for work on the case. And it's designed to be attritional, and it's designed to send a message that it is not worth the hassle of continuing to do this case. But one of the things that's been most depressing about that really has been, one of the tactics that's been most concerning has been the use of impersonation emails. So emails which go out impersonating me as a lawyer and going to a wide range of people around the world.
Including your clients.
Including clients. So we've had fake emails coming in, for example, purporting to be from our client to one of our clerks, just asking for confirmation about travel plans, for example. And I've had emails which I've learned of, which have gone to others, purporting to be me, and they're quite sophisticated spoofs. So one of them that went out about a year and a half ago was an email which went out to all of my senior colleagues in my chambers, just like my law firm, saying, dear colleagues, because of my work on the Jimmy Lai case, I'm an enemy of the state, and I'm putting you all at risk by remaining in chambers with you, and I'm putting my family at risk. So I've decided the only sensible thing to do is for me to resign with immediate effect. Now, the first I knew of it, because of course it didn't come from me and I wasn't copied to it, was when I woke up that morning to a whole range of people saying, are you okay? Can we help? Can we support you? Now, we reported that email, because of course it came, very good spoof, but actually it came from a Gmail email. And Google do have an impersonation policy. So we reported it on the day. to Google. I can tell you it took over a year before we had any engagement whatsoever from Google. And the first time we had engagement was when an MP called Holly Lynch in the UK held a parliamentary meeting to talk to many people who'd been the subject of transnational targeting by China and by Hong Kong because of their work on human rights issues in Hong Kong. Included academics, lawyers, and suddenly we all realised we were all experiencing these tactics, and we'd all attempted to raise it with tech companies to no avail. So that's quite a good example. But more generally, I think on your question, I do think there's, just casting a light on my own profession, I'm not sure how many lawyers there are in the room, I do think there's a real naivety on the part of lawyers working in many of these cases, not just the cases like Jimmy Lai, those lightning rod cases where you know there's a kind of risk and you're publicly targeted. Any lawyer at all who is working on any case involving the states which engage in transnational repression, so UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Russia, and so on, need to have much better security hygiene. I've been frankly horrified by how many times I deal with international lawyers in magic circle firms who'll use Google Docs in a case about Saudi Arabia. I mean, just astonishing. Don't use Signal for sensitive information. So for journalists in the room, I think you've got to be aware that the security training that you have when you're dealing with a sensitive case, one of the weakest points in your armory may well be your lawyers. Are your lawyers paralegals or clerks to the barristers that you're working with when you're in a system involving barristers? Because we know that these states are targeting those weak points, and often, regrettably, lawyers do not have adequate training and don't have good enough security practices. So there's a real issue for lawyers about what they do to stop that happening. And I mean, on that, there's just one example I'd give. Some of you may have seen the Iranian example in January 2022 when families of 6 people who were killed when the Revolutionary Guards shot down a Ukrainian civilian plane, got punitive damages in a Canadian court. And there was a very high-profile example, January 2022, when there was a press conference about the result. And it was interrupted by Iranian hackers. So suddenly in the middle of the online press conference, there was a vulgar video laced with profanity, pornography, and so on, which interrupted it. Now, I would have thought that that would alert people to the fact that if you're dealing with an Iranian case, you've got to assume that your systems are vulnerable. But regrettably, since then, in many cases involving Iran, I have seen total naivety on the part of lawyers, and lawyers not being aware that they need much, much better security hygiene, security systems. So I'm very grateful to you for shining a light on it.
I will definitely come back to that and expand a little bit more. Before we turn to Karuna, I want to go to Jose, who should be with us online. Jose is the son of Jose Ruben Samora, who's a Guatemalan journalist and a founder of 3 Guatemalan newspapers. Among them is El Periódico. Jose, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Good to have you with us. So, Jose, your father has been attacked and threatened for his work for many years. He was held hostage in his own house. He's been kidnapped. He's been beaten up. And now since 2022, he's in jail and he's serving a 6-year sentence accused of money laundering. And these charges are very widely seen as retaliation against the coverage of the corruption within the government. El Periódico forced to shut down in May last year, and you are currently living in exile. Now, to this date, your father's defense had to change, I believe, 10 lawyers, because one by one they were targeted. And in particular, in this particular case of your father, we've seen criminal charges actually being used against lawyers who were trying to defend him. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you have experienced in the case of your father's defense?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I start by saying that my father is innocent and that he has been held hostage for 629 days today. He was held hostage by the former president of Guatemala, Alejandro Yamatei, and now he continues to be held hostage by the corrupt structures within the Guatemalan judiciary. Those structures attacked his law.
Can we try to bring Jose back in? Can we try to bring him back in, because we can't really hear him? Can we try to have him dial him back again, and I'll move to Karuna as we try to do that. Jose, we'll try to come back to you because we cannot really hear you very well. So we'll try to have you dialing him back in on the link,
okay,
and we'll move to Karuna. Karuna, you are a senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India, you are a human rights lawyer, and you also are a member of the high-level legal panel of experts on media freedom, which is part of a mechanism called the MFC, so the Media Freedom Coalition, which brings together governments, lawyers, and also civil society organizations. As a member of the high-level legal panel, you obviously have an overarching view of this trend, the way Carlos obviously has, given the work that he's doing with his organization. Can you give us a bit of a sense of how big this threat is? Because it seems to me, from what we're hearing, that it is a bit of a David versus Goliath dynamic at play.
So when we speak of media freedom, we speak really of defending the people and the pipes that transport truths to the world, right? But when we speak of the attack on lawyers, it is defending these journalists. It's not only an attack on truth, because there's a chilling effect that is sought to be brought on reportage, but it's also an attack on the rule of law. What these cases, what this lawfare is seeking to do is cut the journalist or the journalism off from the legal system, from justice, right? It's very, very serious. It's not new. When Shakespeare wrote in Henry VIII, first kill all the lawyers, it's not, as is sometimes popularly assumed, that because lawyers are particularly venal. It's not a lawyer joke, right? It's because lawyers are often the first bastion for civil liberties in this sense. The kinds of threats that have increased over the years, more recently though, are really a very serious matter for concern. We see interference in bar and professional associations. We see governments, in Belarus for example, saying that they want to have a say, and they do then have a say, in these professional associations, deciding without proper due process and in an unfair manner to take away a lawyer's license. We have the case of Abdul Fattah Soltani in Iran, who is a prominent human rights lawyer, and he co-founded the Center of Human Rights Defenders in Iran with Shireen Ebadi, who some of you will remember is a Nobel laureate. And in 2011, and I want to get this right, which is why I'm looking at my notes, the security forces arrested Soltani after arresting his law offices without a warrant and seized his computers and case files, right? Now, what's the significance of that? Who can tell me? What's the significance of that, seizing his computers and case files? Sorry? Stopping him from being able to work, very important, but also violating legal privilege, right? It's a fishing expedition, plus it violates his legal privilege not only with the clients that they were particularly interested in, a couple of journalists, Akbar Ganji, a dissident journalist, and the family of Zehra Kazemi, the Iranian-born Canadian photojournalist who died in custody, but also all his other clients, right? The thing is that once you act without due process, and once the state comes and arrests the person, he was charged here with spreading propaganda against the regime, assembly and collusion against national security, and accepting, and this is the particularly silly one, an unlawful award. And they initially sentenced Soltani to 18 years in prison and a 20-year prohibition in practicing law. It was then reduced, the prison term, to 13 years, and they overturned the ban on practicing law. So Soltani is only one example. There was another Iranian lawyer who was detained for 25 days. There were various threats to his freedom, but also he was told to stop practicing law. Although he was only detained for 25 days, he in fact did stop practicing law. He was very talented. He had lots of successful cases. So, is this a David versus Goliath fight? Absolutely. We presume sometimes that lawyers have the entire judiciary behind them, or they have the strength of the law behind them. And we must question today whether this is true. Because who makes the law? The executive. Is the law increasingly denying bail in various jurisdictions, just on the asking when there are charges, particularly pertaining to national security and when national security pertains to speech? Now, let us remember that journalists are charged with these crimes and lawyers are charged with the same crimes, right? So just for the asking, when you have a lawyer for the state standing up, frequently a court will say, well, in these cases, the law doesn't really give me the right to provide bail. A judge might say that if it's national security, should I really be intervening in this at this stage? Let the investigation be completed. And the completion of the investigation frequently, or the arrival of a conviction, and sometimes it is as low as 2% of the cases brought, right? It's like waiting for Godot. And the person then loses 6 years, 10 years, 20 years of their lives.
And you see this being a global phenomenon.
This is a global phenomenon. I have various cases, in fact, before me. We put quite a lot of work into this panel. So I have lots of cases before me. And we examine these cases in our work at the high-level panel for media freedom. What this high-level panel is, just for those of you who don't know about it, is an advisory panel it's an independent advisory panel for 50 states. The 50 states of the Media Freedom Coalition that are bound to conduct law reform, provide safe refuge, provide support for not just journalists, for journalists and for lawyers and other human rights defenders whose freedoms are being threatened.
And what can the panel do? I mean, obviously the panel advises government, so
Yes.
it's very close to the same governments that I guess at times are culprits of conducting this lawfare targeting both the journalists and the legal professionals. What are the practical things that the high level can do?
Yeah. So the panel has as its members countries that very broadly embrace media freedom, right? So recently, Afghanistan and Sudan were in fact asked to leave for obvious reasons. But in addition, there are affirmative steps that are required to be taken. So there are at the international level, and Keelan spoke very evocatively about the transnational moves against media freedom. But there are transnational efforts that can be undertaken by countries like the Media Freedom Coalition. Things like Magnitsky sanctions. So what's a Magnitsky sanction? The Magnitsky law was named after Sergei Magnitsky, who was a lawyer in Russia who prosecuted and exposed large-scale corruption and then was killed. This was originally a law in the United States, but the UK, Canada, the EU, there are a number of countries that now have similar measures. The idea is not to impose sanctions against a whole country. So that because the starving children of the country, for example, should not suffer for the ills, for the crimes of a few. What this does is that it targets the people, the individuals who have committed the human rights violation or the violation against international humanitarian law. And
it includes financial, there's a financial freeze on assets.
Precisely.
Yes.
So it includes financial freezes on assets. It can include denial of visas. It can include attaching of properties, which includes, of course, the financial freezing of assets is a part of that. It can include if there's a group of countries imposing Magnitsky sanctions, that can be effective. And then there are a number of countries supplying an emergency visa. So there's the Czech Republic, there is Canada. Canada has been a real leader in this, providing safe refuge on the high-level panel's recommendations to about 1,300 journalists in the recent past. But these numbers are growing very fast. Estonia, Latvia has provided protection to Russian journalists who are being targeted. And there are far fewer lawyers who are targeted, but that trend is increasing.
We'll come back to this, and especially to the Magnitsky Act and the sanctions, because it would be really interesting to see if you could also mention some cases where this has been successful. I would like to try to go back to Jose in case we can hear him better, which I hope is the case. Because, Jose, do we have Jose online? Yes, here he is.
I am.
Jose,
Can you hear me?
we can hear you a little bit better now. I don't know how much you heard what we were saying earlier, but we're talking about the case of your father and the 10 lawyers that were part of his defense. If you can help us contextualize what's happening in your father's case.
So as you were mentioning, this handbook that it's being now used everywhere was used against my father and his legal defense. Throughout the last 620 days, he has been held hostage first by the former president Alejandro Yamatei, and now by the corrupt structures within the judiciary. Within that spurious process, they attacked his legal defense, and he has had 10 lawyers throughout the entire process. The entire process was not only fabricated, but they violated all of his rights. And one of those rights, like one of the main rights, is the right to a legal defense. And they started from day one. During the first hearing, the judge said that there was a case against his lawyers, and that they needed to be removed immediately. And those first lawyers were imprisoned. They were held in prison for almost 2 weeks. One of them has openly talked about being tortured. He was held in a small cell, naked. They like showered him and left him there like wet, and they also took away his medication. He actually posted something when he came out saying how they had tortured him. And one of the other things that they did in Guatemala that I think also adds to this is that in Guatemala, the corrupt actors in Congress passed a law that allows people who were charged with corruption charges to accept charges. And if they accepted the charges, they would allow them to be freed, and there wouldn't be any consequences. So what the Yamatei administration started to do, and the General Attorney's Office, is that they also like put these lawyers in prison, torture them, and then they pushed them to accept charges. Because if they didn't accept charges, they would have kept them there. So they accepted charges to get out, which really didn't impact them or my father's process, but also like communications-wise, that's something the prosecutor's office always uses, like, oh, so his lawyers already accepted charges, so like he must be guilty. So it's also like an additional tactic. Then there was another lawyer. He wasn't Guatemalan, but he had been living in Guatemala for over 15 years. He had a law firm. He had many clients. He was like really a fantastic lawyer. And from one day to the other, after they knew he had the case, first they started harassing him online. Then suddenly all of his the cases he was had with other clients, he started losing them. And then both he heard and we found out through our sources that they were planning to disbar him, right? Which is something that was already mentioned here. They were planning to disbar him and say, like at the next hearing, that everything that he had worked on in Guatemala for the last 15 years was illegal, and they were planning to arrest him at the hearing and take him to prison, because that's also part of this entire movement, right? Like also like criminalizing the journalists, criminalizing their lawyers, and like send this message that it's an entire like organized crime, right? Then the next two lawyers, they also charged them for falsification of documents. They also were sent to prison. They also forced them to accept charges. And as soon as they accepted charges, they let them out, right? Like, and so it continued to go on until the point where really no lawyer wanted to take the case, right? Like, because they knew the consequences. So the last part of the process, my father has been, his legal defense has been the public defendants. The public defendants that have been in charge of his case have been fantastic, but they also have their own set of challenges, right? In a way, they are part of the system. The system is against them, and they also attack them. Like one of the first one from the legal defense to take the case, she was probably the best one. She was harassed, and then she was sued. They said that the way she had received the case, because they knew she was really good, had been through connections with my father, which my father then had never known her before. So at the end, they took her away. And this happened the night before the most important hearing. And they gave the case to another member of the public defense who had no experience in litigation. He had never read the case file. He had never seen my father until 5 minutes before the hearing. And he, from what we learned, had more of an administrative position at the public defense. So it's been like that like the entire process has been very difficult. Also, the public defense is very nervous about working with us because the system is on top of them. So it's very hard to communicate with them. And it's very hard, like when you have a case like this and the entire like system and the state going after you, it's very hard to work if you can't talk with your lawyers on a daily basis, right? So it's been really complicated.
It seems very complicated at multiple levels, and I would like to talk about the financing aspect as well if we got time. But before we do that, because it's 38 past the hour, I really would like to open up for questions, and then perhaps we'll go to a final round of questions to the panelists. If there are any questions from the room, we'll take them now. If not, we'll carry on because there's so much to talk about. But I just wanted to give the opportunity to the audience.
And I think it's so important what you are highlighting, because even as journalists and civil society actors working in this space, we don't pay nearly enough attention to this issue. But my question is about the function of big tech in this. I mean, we know this is the case with journalism, that there have been failures to respond in a timely manner, but there's also been the creation of an enabling environment for the kind of persecution and threat landscape that journalists face. And what Keelan was describing before about Google taking an entire year to respond to a clearly plausible spoof that was potentially extremely damaging. I'd be interested, if you have time, if you could address for us what responsibilities big technology companies have. They've utterly failed to address the risks facing journalists. It sounds like the same is true with lawyers, but you have other resources and strategies at your fingertips. So if you
Thank you,
respond
Julie.
to that.
Who wants to take this one? Keelan, you want to get... How did you resolve this? Because there should be mechanisms like...
Yeah, so I suppose there's two things. First of all, Julie, I agree with you entirely on the threat landscape more generally. And many of the tactics which have been used against journalists including tactics used against female journalists. We're now starting to see them being used against lawyers for journalists and indeed female lawyers for journalists. So much of the abuse which I receive is misogynistic. You know, it's rape threats, very graphic dismemberment type threats and so on, and threats related to my appearance. So the kind of thing which I've been dealing with for many years with the way in which Maria Ressa is abused and targeted, or the way in which Daphne Caruana Galizia was abused and targeted on a much smaller scale. We're starting to see some of those tactics now being used in a secondary way against lawyers. And for those of you who aren't familiar with her work, Julie's work in this area has been transformational about female journalists, and you've described them being at the epicenter of risk, particularly when you're dealing with female journalists and female journalists of colour who are abused so much online. So again, I'm acutely conscious of my privilege. I experience just a very small subset of the kind of thing which my clients see. But there's that whole issue about the threat landscape. But the other point on the specific issues we see that are concerning about lawyers, the impersonation issues are really troubling me, because it's a crime in the vast majority of countries across the world to impersonate a lawyer for very good reason. This goes to your point earlier about privileged material, because if you impersonate a lawyer, you can obtain very sensitive privileged material very easily. So when someone sends an email out purporting to be a lawyer and seeking access to information, not only causes risk to the lawyer, but causes really serious risk to the clients who may be receiving it. So one example of that, some of you may have seen the report that was produced by the NGO Safeguard Defenders on Chinese overseas police stations a number of years ago, about the police stations dotted around the world which were used to target Chinese and Hong Kong dissidents abroad. Now, on the day when that report came out, I tweeted to say how impressive it was that the long arm of the Chinese state was being highlighted in this way. And a couple of days later, I got a message from someone at Safeguard Defenders to say, thanks very much for your offer of support. I just want to confirm these emails have come from you. And what had happened was, on the day, again, sophisticated spoof purporting to be me, had gone to the author at Safeguard Defenders to say, I know we follow each other online, but we haven't spoken directly, all of which was true. I've been a big admirer of your work for a long time. I'd like to offer you my pro bono support on this issue about transnational repression. And she believed it and engaged. And about 4 emails in, she started being asked sensitive information about sources. And she just thought, this seems a little odd over open email. So she got a little suspicious, approached me in another way, and it turned out that really this was a targeted phishing attack. It was privilege phishing. Now, there's many other examples of that. I mean, I had a false email which went from me to Tom Tugendhat MP, the Security Minister, saying, attached, please find a bill. It's been great to work with you. And actually the message, that was a different one because it was designed to be a name that's trusted. And then when you open the email, it had malware in it to target him. Yeah. So those are really troubling. And the idea is the lawyer's name is like open sesame. It's a trusted name. You hand over information. Now, I think on this, the regulatory bodies and the tech companies need to be working together. So we already have, in some instances, media organizations, for example, when there's fake accounts put up about certain journalists, there's a hotline in order to try to get the accounts taken down. Fully appreciate that is not working at all as well as it should be, but it's there. So there should be an equivalent form of immediate hotline for lawyers through their regulatory body, where your law society or your bar council, the regulatory body, can immediately get through to a point of contact in the tech companies to say, we've learned of this, what's happening? You shouldn't have to start from scratch, be learning what to do, and so on.
You want to jump in around this point?
Yes, very quickly. So look, most of our lives now are lived online, right? Whether they're professional lives or personal lives. If you are a woman, and in particular a woman of color, being in the public domain is something that is already exposes you to rape threats and death threats on an everyday basis, right? If you are also somebody who's challenging the status quo through your work, then that exposes you that much more. Now, there's a lot of thought and work that's gone into regulating speech online. Takedowns, for instance. I was one of the counsel in a case called Shreya Singhal, which is the definitive online free speech case, which said that, which talked about platform liability, website blocking, intermediary guidelines. There isn't enough attention that's given to platforms enforcing their terms of use. Google, for instance, Twitter, they have very, very limited language capability in languages other than English. That's one problem. The second problem, even when you look at reporting for rape threats or death threats or impersonation or anything else, and it's in their terms of use. It's treated purely, almost purely, as a matter of contract. It's not treated as a matter of regulation by the state, and nobody is forcing them to flesh out the mechanisms through which they actually perform their obligations in their terms of use. When we look at WhatsApp, for instance, and WhatsApp was forced to create backdoors and weaken what they had promised when people signed up, the 256-bit encryption that used to make it safe. It no longer does. Use Signal if in doubt. That not enough attention is given to that. When we look at Pegasus, when we look at hacking, when we look at hacking by governments, and when we look at, of course, phishing, which is what Keelan went through, this is something that isn't sufficiently, that people in general and lawyers aren't sufficiently protected against. So I do think that regulators must look much more stringently at whether platforms that are purporting to govern themselves through their terms of use are fulfilling the promises they make, because they absolutely are not.
Carlos, any thoughts? You work with a large community of lawyers that work either pro bono or lo bono.
Yeah.
Anything that you heard from the cyber aspect, the legal threats that we've been spiraling out of control, you take the pulse of this on a daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, this is stuff that we have seen, we observe almost on a daily basis, and particularly the use of surveillance technology, like, as you mentioned, Pegasus. So we are now representing almost 30 journalists at the European Court of Human Rights who have been targeted by Pegasus in Eastern Europe, and developing cases in other regions as well. And we see that then their lawyers are targeted as well by these governments. They don't stop at the journalist, or they don't stop at a human rights defender, they continue. And this is makes working with them very difficult. And I think I totally appreciate what Keelan says about digital hygiene and security, because that is a very serious problem. And that leads as well to more physical threats. The number of lawyers arrested, prosecutor in jail because of their work defending journalists is something extremely serious. And I had just had a comment about what Jose was saying. I mean, the Clooney Foundation and the American Bar Association went to Guatemala to observe the trial, and they wrote a very in-depth report, I think almost 100 pages long, detailing all the due process failures in that case. So if anyone is interested, I would recommend them reading. But I tried to get him a lawyer. I was aware of what was happening, and I approached a lawyer who we trusted to take the case. And his reply was, okay, I could do it. I don't have a family, so I won't be threatened that way. But I have 6 other high-profile cases. I'm defending a former prosecutor, another journalist, and a lawyer. And if I take this case, they will suffer. My clients will suffer. So that was yet another reason for him not being able to take the case. He wanted to, but his duty to his clients prevented him from taking the case. And that led, Jose already mentioned, he was defended by the public defenders, because there was no private lawyer in the whole country who was able to take the case for him. And especially in other more violent jurisdictions, and I would just mention Cameroon, Vietnam, and Azerbaijan, where governments really don't hold anything to go after anyone who criticized them or is defending their critics. I think that's something that we need to look very carefully at. The international pressure and the Free Media Coalition could be an avenue to put pressure on these countries. When you mentioned someone transferred from Thailand to China, we have a similar case of a journalist who was renditioned from Thailand to Vietnam via Cambodia a few years ago. And then his lawyer couldn't even make the very brief appearance in court to defend him, because he was also charged with tax evasion, and he's spending 10 years in jail. So situations like that really bring to fore, I think, the danger that lawyers also face together with journalism, obviously.
actually up with time, so we're just that time, and I think we need to really end here. There's obviously a conversation that we could carry on for hours, unfortunately. We're going to continue this conversation at our Trust Conference in October in London, so if you are in London, it's a free event. There's a QR code you can scan, I believe, in order to put your name in the list. So if you're in London on the 22nd and 23rd of October, please come and join us to continue this conversation as well, among many others. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Keelan. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Karuna. And thank you, Jose, who's I hope is still online.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.